February 11th, Pope Benedict announces his resignation to be operational in 2 weeks. On February 12th, the ATM systems became operational and were turned back on. It was, for anybody looking at it, was a quid pro quo.
Hey, my friends, welcome to the John Henry Westen Show. You know, when we published at LifeSite the other day the exclusive story about the Vatican court actually looking into the validity of the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, well, it sparked a lot of interest. One of the people who reached out to me first was this lady, whom you're going to meet right now. You know her very well. Lawyer Liz Yore, a child rights activist who has been with LifeSite for many years, was originally one of the co-hosts of our Faith and Reason program. She did a deep dive trying to investigate what went on with the Benedict resignation and how that plays into what we saw the Vatican become, which was like a 180-degree flip from where it used to be. Liz, so good to be with you.
Great to be with you, John Henry. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, that's an honor for me. Let's begin as we always do with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen.
The big news, of course, right now is this war between, very public war, between Leo and President Trump. And yeah, there's a lot of craziness going on from President Trump. However, a lot of people are seeing through it. They're seeing through to the political realities. Let me just read this. This is a tweet, and it's a tweet from General Flynn. He says, and I quote, "The left are so revealing. Axelrod goes to see the Pope, and 3 things occur. Pope attacks Trump, Cardinals do 60 Minutes, and Pope goes to mosque. More to come. American Catholics better wake up."
As I've often said, I was weaned on the Chicago Democratic political system, so this is all very familiar to me. This is familiar territory, and this is the Vatican really. General Flynn is right. This is the Vatican doubling down and aligning with the Chicago Obama network constructed by the Marxist policies of Saul Alinsky and Chicago Cardinal Joseph Seamless Garment Bernardine, pushing the globalist policies of immigration, Muslim superiority, and globalist eco-terrorism. You know, and what my warning to Catholics is the clock is ticking down to Agenda 2030. And we are in a race against time with the globalists actually are falling behind largely because of 2 Donald Trump terms. It is interesting to see these lobbying back and forth of these comments between Trump and Leo. But I think we're going to see more of a ramping up of this in the very near future.
That agenda is really the start of our story, because this story goes back in history now to 2012, even before 2012, but it's about the opposition to the globalist agenda that was coming not from a Donald Trump in the White House, because there wasn't one, but from one Pope, who we all knew for the longest time as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who then became Benedict XVI. Explain that for us.
Yes, we learned that in February 2012, exactly 1 year before Benedict's shocking abdication, John Podesta and other Democratic operatives proposed a Catholic Spring, a Catholic revolution, to install this Catholic Spring to demand an end to, you may remember, the Middle Ages dictatorship within the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict represented the Middle Age dictator that Podesta and his Democratic operatives had targeted. He was clearly an obstructionist to their modern agenda. And what was interesting is I went into the WikiLeaks cables and examined what was going on between the Vatican and the U.S. State Department throughout the early years and middle years of the administration of Benedict. And what I found was that Benedict posed in many ways this clear and present danger. He was the 2030 agenda, which, as everybody may recall, in 2015, Soros announced that they were going to have a mass migration of Muslims into Europe. And it was essential that this move with ease, without any pushing back from the Vatican. And yet we know from the WikiLeaks cable, we know that Benedict was actually the one who was, you remember he took the name Benedict because he wanted to re-Christianize Europe. And he strongly criticized unrestrained migration in Europe. And that was duly noted by the State Department cables. Number two, he refused to sign the agreement with the CCP because he did not trust the Chinese operatives. And he knew, in these are in terms in the cable, he knew that the Chinese would violate the terms of the agreement. Three, Benedict, and this is all in the cables, also demanded reciprocity from Muslim religious leaders, requiring a respect for religious freedom for Christians living in Muslim-dominated countries. And when they kept on talking about interreligious faith and religious freedom, he kept pushing back and demanding reciprocity. Benedict also personally and publicly castigated Nancy Pelosi when she went to meet with him in the Vatican. She lied about their meeting, and he instructed her not to present herself for communion because of her pro-abort policies. Benedict also issued, of course, the famous Summorum Pontificum, a restoration of the traditional Latin Mass, thereby infuriating liberal Catholic prelates. And probably most personally, Benedict instructed the very powerful, connected sexual predator Cardinal Ted McCarrick to step away from public ministry because of his persistent allegations of sexual abuse. And McCarrick, as we know, served as the spiritual mentor of all the Catholic Democratic politicians, including Biden and Kennedy. So he was the persona non grata, Benedict was. And he was that obstruction. He was that middle-aged dictator that they talked about that needed to be removed so that the modernists could roll out the UN Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. So he was, in my opinion, based on these cables that were coming back to the Department of State, it was clearly recognized. They were tracking his activities, they were tracking his comments and his speeches, and it was presenting a picture of a pope that was going to be a huge obstacle to the New World Order, the Synodal Church, the St. Gallen Mafia agenda.
The emails themselves, they call for this new Catholic spring. These are the emails that came out in 2016 with the WikiLeaks thing from the Hillary leaked emails. And so we got this fascinating picture of the State Department, the Obama State Department, super interested in doing something about the problem they see as Pope Benedict. And the problem not only for themselves, but for this whole global liberal plan, as you say, Agenda 2030. Your contention is they might have moved to do something to get to the new scenario, to get to the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. Something stunning, never seen before like that in the church. Yes, there was something 500 years ago, but it doesn't matter. If it didn't happen in the past, 100 years, you're not talking modern history. What makes you suspicious that there is that possibility? Apart from the fact that, yeah, they're very unhappy with him. They want rid of him somehow. They're hinting at a new Catholic spring. How that's going to happen, nobody knows. What's your thoughts as to how that might have played out?
Well, we know there were color revolutions brought on in the Ukraine and various other countries by the CIA and the government. A color revolution was not unusual. This was a recognition, of course, that one of the most powerful, albeit smallest, sovereign nations in the world is the Vatican. And the moral voice of a Pope Benedict, who is brilliant and who could articulate the issues and who understood after being head of the CDF for 25 years, he understood the global issues and both political and theological. He posed a big problem for what was being planned. And so, a color revolution in the church was actually what they were looking at. They called it a Catholic Spring. They did the same thing with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I think it was 2014. So this was the moving out of a leader and installing someone who would be amenable to the modernist agenda, someone that they could work with. And I don't think they realized how momentous this resignation was, the first in 600 years. As a result, we began to find out that, in fact, there was a secret group meeting for many years, the St. Gallen Mafia, which involved Cardinal Danneels and Cardinal Martini and all these liberal cardinals and Cardinal McCarrick, plotting to find the next replacement for once John Paul II passed away, and installing a modernist agenda. Well, along came Benedict and ruined their plans. However, just like all liberals and leftists, they don't give up. And so the 2012 WikiLeaks emails with Podesta indicate that there were discussions underway about what to do about this conservative Pope in Benedict, who became a real problem. Now, I think people have to understand, somebody like John Podesta, who is Catholic, a liberal Catholic, very aware of what goes on in the Vatican. He was very attuned to the power and machinations going on in the Vatican. And you'll recall, once Francis was installed, Francis himself, during the 2016 election, became very involved. Remember, he called Trump unchristian. He went after Trump left and right on the border issues. So this was, they had felt that once Francis was in place, that they could roll out their new agenda.
Let's get back to the resignation, because I think there's some really interesting things that happened. Everybody was alive at the time, was sort of so stunned because you're taken aback. At one point, you might have thought, that's a joke, that's not really happened. But sure enough, it had happened. But there was a number of anomalies right out of the gate. So for one, everybody remembered that right before Benedict became Pope, he said, "Pray for me that I don't flee from the wolves." That was like right before he became Pope. Like he accepted, and he said that right out of the gate. He's like, "Pray for me so I don't flee." But then this all starts to play out. But one thing that happened right out of the gate with the announcement of the resignation was there was an Italian journalist that pointed something out, Mario Blondet, I think his name was, but he pointed something out about the banking system that I think you picked up on right away. Tell us about that, what happened, and how it played out.
Before Benedict, in about, I think, January 1st, around that time, before the height of the tour season in Rome, before he actually announced his resignation, the ATM Vatican system was shut down, meaning none of the ATMs could be used to secure any kind of cash. It was a huge problem, as you can imagine. And it is what they call the SWIFT system, which is an international system of banking, which shut down the ATMs all in the Vatican. This was a rare, highly unprecedented action. It's only been done, I think, twice before in, much more volatile situations. But suddenly the SWIFT system shut down, and it really paralyzed the financial dealings in the Vatican. Now, February 11th, Pope Benedict announces his resignation to be operational in 2 weeks. On February 12th, the ATM systems became operational and were turned back on. It was clearly, for anybody looking at it, was a quid pro quo. There was no rhyme or reason why suddenly, after the announcement of the resignation, that these ATMs should be suddenly turned back on. That was one of kind of some very, curious machinations behind what was going on in the Vatican Bank and in the international financial system. Interestingly, the United States largely operates the SWIFT system. It's a smooth running system used by most of the primary banks around the world. In reconciliation with respect to debits and filings and deposits. But it also has control over ATMs. And so This was a real head scratcher. The system, the financial system basically in the Vatican would be shut down and turned back on when Benedict announced his resignation.
The resignation has all sorts of controversy around it because if it was forced, it wouldn't have any effect. Of course, the contention of Andrea Cionci, who a professor, a friend of his, was on my show to explain his position. He feels that, he didn't resign because Benedict made a difference between a munus and ministerium, the sort of active and prayerful role of the pontificate. You can't do that. Therefore, he was actually not resigning. In Cionci's estimation, he wasn't resigning at all. He was saying, basically, I can't deal with this, so I'm going to fake a resignation so that they elect someone who won't really be Pope. But there's all sorts of theories out there about that, and they differ. But essentially, we also know there's another odd thing about the resignation, and you alluded to it earlier when you talked about the San Gallen Mafia, and the fact that McCarrick was part of it. It's interesting. You mentioned Cardinal Daniels, who, incidentally, shows up on the balcony of Francis when he's elected. But that's because Daniels and Francis knew each other really well. As you mentioned, in the 2005 election where Benedict came out, the San Gallen Mafia, this group that met in St. Gallen, Switzerland, that's why it was called the San Gallen Mafia. And they're called Mafia actually because Daniels lets it be known that's what they're called. He did a public interview where when a biography of his came out, where he actually explains the whole story in his own words. But he met with these different cardinals, leftist cardinals from around the church, to get rid of Benedict. They met for years because in 2005 they tried and failed to get, guess who elected, according to him, is Francis Bergoglio. So they tried to elect Jorge Bergoglio, doesn't work in 2005, and then Benedict retires. In Julia Maloney's book, which I think is the best book on the San Gallen Mafia, she was on my show explaining it. She explains that Cardinal Martini had made an agreement with Benedict at the time in 2005 to allow him the election as long as he would resign. And apparently, Martini went to visit him and said, it's time. There's another point of reference, if you will. But it's very interesting also because this conspiracy is going on. The very fact that we know absolutely beyond any shadow of a doubt, there's this huge conspiracy of cardinals working to get rid of Benedict and to work to elect Jorge Maria Bergoglio, who eventually comes in, is contrary to the rules of the election of a pope. It can't be. There's a document called Universi Dominici Gregis, which is the rule book. It's the Constitution, actually. It was created by John Paul II about how a pope needs to be elected. Because with all the modern nonsense, with all the tampering you can do, obviously there are major problems possible. And one of the things was, well, you can't have this kind of collusion for guaranteeing of votes, et cetera, et cetera. And John Paul lays that out in Universi Dominici Gregis. And I want to read this one section of it because it's stunning. And it talks about this very thing. Paragraph 76 says, and this, please go look it up, Universi Dominici Gregis, John Paul II Constitution, says, should the election take place in a way other than prescribed in the present Constitution, or should the conditions laid down here not be observed, the election is for this very reason null and void, without any need for a declaration on the matter. Consequently, it confers no right on the one elected. Make of it what you will, but that's there in black and white for everyone to read. We should continue with the political analysis because I think it's fascinating in addition to this. So there's a clear agenda from the Obama administration and the powers that be that perhaps even rule them, the liberal agenda of the world, let's say, that wants 2030 in place, Agenda 2030 in place. Major roadblock, probably the major roadblock, is Benedict, refusing, as you said, to go off on the China deal. They're just terrible. They're conspiring among the cardinals to get rid of Benedict. Then the very guy at the center of that conspiracy among the cardinals, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, is also a useful tool of the Obama administration. Tell us how.
McCarrick was a diplomatic envoy for both the Biden and the Obama administration, secretly conveying messages between the Vatican and Cuba secretly meeting in Iran. McCarrick was everywhere. He carried a U.S. diplomatic passport. He was also on the U.S. State Department's Religious Freedom Commission, Interfaith Religious Dialogue Commission. He was everywhere. He had his finger in the global pulse. He was also on how many, 9, 10 trips to China, very well known in China. And he ultimately, as we know, became the architect of the China deal with Francis, the deal which, contrary to what Francis said, was absolutely negated, deep-sixed, thrown in the garbage by Pope Benedict. So we have this, the machinations of McCarrick in and out of the White House, in and out of the Situation Room. I mean, literally, if you read his books, his documents, actually the McCarrick Report, you see what a masterful politician he was in promoting the liberal agenda of the Catholic Church, the radical Marxist policies of the Obama administration. He was resurrected once Benedict was forced to step down. And, and I think it's quite interesting that they needed McCarrick in the second administration of the Obama team to continue these diplomatic envoy trips to cut deals in secret with essentially some of whom were enemies of the United States.
For U.S. residents, creating a will has never been easier. Thanks to My Legacy Will, an online platform free of charge, you can now create your own will and choose to include LifeSite news in it. Specify where your funeral will take place, the number of masses to be offered for your soul, and how your estate would be distributed. We would be deeply grateful if you remembered LifeSite news in your will. Visit mylegacywill.com/LifeSite news. Thank you for your support, and may God bless you.
They had to have McCarrick, and they knew that Benedict was such a problem. I'm going to tell you an interchurch issue that might seem, oh, that's only church, but it has such a massive implication on politics. So I'll take you back even further than 2012. Let's go back to 2004. Now, these are still the days of John Paul II. However, as you mentioned, we always had Benedict with us in the person of Cardinal Ratzinger, and he always worked closely with John Paul. Ratzinger and John Paul and Benedict, when he became Pope, were trying to push one thing big time, especially in America, because it has to be America first. There's a whole reason for that you'll have to go to another show for. But they wanted to push that politicians who support abortion, and by the way, people who vote for pro-abortion politicians, are not to be able to receive Holy Communion. Now that, my friends, would change the political scene. At least it would have way back in the early 2000s. If you knew as a Catholic, oh crap, if I vote for this politician, he's pro-abortion, I can't receive Holy Communion, at least in good conscience. And the politicians themselves, oh, if I vote for abortion, yeah, I'll get ahead politically, but oh boy, I'll not be a Catholic, and that won't go well with my Catholic constituents. So that's a big thing, perhaps even a game changer. So that had to be gotten rid of. Who got rid of it? Well, in 2004, there was a committee of the U.S. bishops that were looking at the question. Guess who headed up that commission? Cardinal McCarrick. Later, who we know, by the way, is a sex abuser, and now Mr. McCarrick, but that's a different story. Nonetheless, he held so much power in the American church, it was unreal. He actually lied. He hid the communication that came from Cardinal Ratzinger through to the U.S. bishops, because he was the head of the committee. He hid it from the other bishops on the committee, and he lied to them saying, oh, Rome wants the bishop to decide locally for himself, not do. It was a lie. Later that came out, and at first, McCarrick tried to say, oh, that's just fake news. And Cardinal Ratzinger's office, by the way, said, no, it's a real document. So he was outed that way as a big liar. The very fact that it has such big political implications shows that all by itself, even though it's a church matter, has huge political ramifications. So therefore was a real threat to the political agenda of the leftists. So now fast forward, what happens is McCarrick, the same guy who kiboshed it then, comes in to bring us the Pope. And remember, McCarrick lobbied among the cardinals for Francis. So he brings in their guy who wants to get rid of exactly that thing. Let's move over to the Francis as being the answer to a lot of what the globalists were concerned about. How do you see Francis as the answer to their prayers, if you will?
Well, he immediately began pushing the UN agenda. He spoke to the UN General Assembly. He addressed them in support of the Paris Climate Treaty. He supported the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which included contraception, abortion, transgender issues, bisexuality, the whole homosexual agenda, to say nothing of the radical modernist agenda. He became the moral voice for the Agenda 2030. And he stepped right into it with energy and force and put his imprimatur on all these radical documents, the Paris Climate Treaty, and of course supported the migration of the mass migration that came into Europe, which we're still dealing with the terrible consequences of that. So there he was, following the orders to the tune. It became, very troublesome for Catholics in dealing with this, in my opinion, Marxist South American Pope, who was radically pushing the Obama agenda and the globalist agenda. So he was everything that they wanted and more.
Now, remember, folks, it's not only political, because the political is so tied to the moral. Remember, Pope Francis was the who am I to judge on homosexuality right out of the gate. So then later comes the meetings with James Martin and the whole revolution, which changes the church seemingly almost completely. However, there's a hiccup that's thrown into things in 2016 with the first election of President Donald J. Trump. And it's at this point, shortly after his election, that you intervened with a number of people to get some records out of the U.S. administration. Tell us about that.
Despite Podesta and Obama and the Democratic Party's best efforts, Hillary Clinton did not win. Donald Trump won. So January 20th, 2017, the day he was first inaugurated, we sent a letter through the Remnant newspaper. I'm sure many, many Catholics have referred to it, the open letter to Donald Trump to investigate whether or not the Obama administration engineered a coup or regime change of the Benedict papacy to install a modernist in the chair of Peter. So that was our request. And we had several questions that we asked the Trump administration to look into. We were simply asking for the Trump administration to investigate the Obama administration and what were they doing behind the scenes during the papacy of Pope Benedict. And because we felt that there appeared to be a very coordinated campaign to radicalize the Catholic Church leadership and to create the coup that we saw. So we asked these questions. Now there was a lot of information, news reports coming up that the NSA, the National Security Agency, monitored the conclave over the years that elected Pope Francis. We asked that question: to what end was the NSA monitoring the conclave that elected Pope Francis? Number two, what other covert operations were carried out by the U.S. government operatives concerning the resignation of Pope Benedict and the conclave that elected Pope Francis? Number three, did the United States government operatives have contact with the St. Gallen Mafia? Number four, international monetary issue transactions with the Vatican were suspended by SWIFT during the last few days prior to the resignation of Pope Benedict through the SIS system. Were any U.S. government agencies involved in this? If so, how? And a couple final questions. Why were international monetary transactions immediately resumed? What documents existed that turned the ATMs back on February 12th, 2013, the day that the sixth day after Benedict the 16th announced his resignation? We did not believe that that was a coincidence. And what actions, if any, were actually taken by John Podesta, Hillary Clinton, and others tied to the Obama administration who were involved in discussions proposing the fomenting of a Catholic Spring? Finally, what roles were played by George Soros and other international financiers regarding the abdication of Pope Benedict? Now, John Henry, I have to say that this letter had an enormous impact in the Catholic world. I heard from people Catholics from around the world, hoping and praying that the Trump administration would jump in and answer these questions. They had access to all these intelligence files. They could declassify these files. We were arguing a coup of the Catholic Church, and in opposition to rules that had been set down by Pope John Paul II. We sought an investigation, a search for records based on these questions. And should any investigation reveal that the U.S. government interfered inappropriately in a papal election, that should be immediately told to the Vatican authorities. However, we never received an acknowledgement or response from our 2017 letter to President Trump. He obviously got very busy with his own Russiagate problems, but nevertheless, that was an opportunity where they were sitting on information, documents from the Obama administration, where they could have done a search of those documents to determine what kind of meddling, interference, communication, strategy sessions were ongoing between the Obama administration and the Vatican and the St. Gallen Mafia, and to elect Pope Francis and to force the abdication of Pope Benedict.
Sure. We just saw exactly that happen with the current Trump administration, because they just did a deep dive into the use of the Biden administration to attack pro-lifers. They did an 800-plus page report showing the documents that prove the Biden administration colluded directly with abortionists to target Catholics, to target Christians, to target pro-lifers. It was unbelievable. And when you see it, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Everything we suspected and worse is true.
This is a 900-page report from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division detailing newly uncovered documents that show direct collusion between former Joe Biden's DOJ and pro-abortion groups like the National Abortion Federation, and going after and targeting and weaponizing the justice system against pro-life advocates. And this report also details the use of undercover informants to infiltrate pro-life meetings and build cases against advocates. And it was a targeted, weaponized campaign using the FACE Act against pro-lifers. We know many pro-lifers, senior citizens, spent long months and years in jail because they were prosecuted unfairly, inequitably under the FACE Act. So this is not a fishing expedition. This is not some pie in the sky. We have not only the documents of the 900-page report on the pro-life weaponization under the FACE Act, but we also know, and you featured him on your show yourself, the weaponization against traditional Catholics by the FBI, that the FBI infiltrated Catholic Church, the traditional Catholic community, sent an intelligence memo around the United States FBI offices targeting traditional Latin Mass going Catholics as radical extremist terrorists. This is what the Biden administration did in secret, unbeknownst to us, although we suspected, in order to take out conservative Catholics who they view, and this is important for traditional Catholics to understand, They view traditional Catholics who go to Mass, whether they're traditional or not, but weekly Mass goers, as the largest threat to the radical modernist agenda of the globalists and the radical lefts in the Democratic Party. They recognize that we, in their mind, are the enemy, and they have used all the weapons in government to put us under heel. And so that's why I feel very strongly that this is not a fishing expedition that we're going on with respect to what happened in the Obama administration while Benedict was creating, his agenda in the Vatican and really promoting his policies of restoring Christianity into Europe and around the world, and actually fighting tooth and nail in his own quiet, genteel way against the modernist eco agenda.
Obviously, if the U.S. is and has done, and now it's known publicly, that they have done color revolutions and do the expenditure to have spies, if you will, go out to Catholic churches and do their research, surely they could have done that with regard to the papacy as well, especially considering it's so important in the estimation of the Obama administration, as is pointed out by the emails themselves. But some of those allegations that you made in the 2017 letter might seem extreme until, because I want to focus on this first one, until you actually see the evidence. So to what end was the National Security Agency monitoring the conclave that elected Pope Francis? What? But everybody's like, come on, were they really? Yeah, actually, yeah. So here, this is from the Los Angeles Times. Headline, magazine says NSA spied on Vatican, U.S. denies it. The U.S. National Security Agency may have spied on the future Pope Francis in the run-up to his election in March, an Italian magazine reported Wednesday. The NSA strongly denied the report, but without citing sources, Panorama magazine said the NSA intercepted calls in and out of the Rome residence where cardinals stayed before the papal conclave. And while, of course, LA Times is spinning that to be against Francis, guess what? It also works against Benedict. LA Times is not a junior newspaper. They're not going to report, well, some wacko Italian magazine said this. But not only is it on their credibility, also National Catholic Register, which we know is a very serious news outlet. Edward Penton, probably the best Vatican reporter ever. He had this to say in the National Catholic Register. Italian magazine says NSA listened into Vatican and Pope. The National Security Agency has been listening into telephone calls of the Pope and senior Vatican officials. An Italian magazine has claimed in an article in Panorama, which will appear on newsstands tomorrow, the NSA is reported to have allegedly taped the phone calls of Vatican officials and senior prelates before and during the conclave, as well as incoming and outgoing calls from Domus Internationalis residents where the Pope was living before his election. So in other words, that refers to Francis. But isn't that interesting? So these requests you're making for information from the Trump administration in 2016 that he got in, you're asking in 2017, they're questions based on what's actual fact. So, but then you hear nothing from them for a long time. And then you pursue this again last year. Why is that? What happened?
Fast forward to April of 2025, myself and another signatory to the original 2017 letter submitted numerous FOIAs to the Trump administration. FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act. It's a request for information from the government regarding documents, emails, communications, correspondence that are in the possession of the government. The purpose of the FOIAs is transparency, it's openness in government, that we are the people, this is our government, we are entitled to know information. And so this FOIA system is available to all citizens to ask government to provide information that we request, any kind of information that's submitted to the government. And so in April of 2025, once Trump got back into office, we submitted several FOIAs to the FBI, the Department of Justice, the State Department, the NSA, the Office of Tulsi Gabbard, the Treasury Department, all these relevant federal agencies that would have had information regarding the circumstances surrounding the abdication of Pope Benedict. We are not asking for Trump. This is not information under the Trump administration that the Trump administration created. These are documents that were created during the Obama administration. FOIAs under law are supposed to be responded to. It was a hefty request, but we just took that original letter because, frankly, John Henry, nothing's changed. If anything, in the interim of the last 8 years or so, or 6 years, we have only been further confirmed that our hunch, based on the conduct of the Democrats who came into the Biden administration, that our hunches about what went on during the abdication and the conclave are ones that we should pursue. So those FOIAs went to the Trump administration. The Trump administration has responded acknowledgement of the receipt of these FOIAs, but has not responded substantively to any of these FOIA requests. And what is so frustrating is that, now we have this volley of words and war between Leo and Trump. The Trump administration, I'm convinced, has information that, for the sake of the Catholic Church and, frankly, civilization, will uncover the violation of church and canon law with respect to the abdication of Pope Benedict and the election of Pope Francis. I mean, the church has been in a pitched battle with respect to what is going on between the modernists pushing their agenda and the traditional Catholics who are just exploding, yet are not having any ability to practice their faith, having churches shut down. And here the Trump administration needs to respond to these FOIA requests and to, if they need to, declassify this information. And this information needs to be in the hands forthwith to the Vatican Criminal Commission that is investigating the abdication of Pope Benedict. The Vatican Office of the Promoter of Justice at this point formally has opened a criminal investigation into the validity of Pope Benedict. Now, it's 14 years later, mind you, and I frankly don't have a lot of confidence that the Vatican is going to, conduct the proper investigation. But I'm convinced that the Trump administration has information that is highly relevant and probative of this investigation. And this information needs to be in the possession of the Vatican. It needs to be disclosed to the Catholic world in order to ensure that a proper investigation for in memoriam. The Trump administration has got to submit all this information regarding the abdication of Benedict and the possible role of the Obama and U.S. government. I mean, if it's not there, it's not there, but at least look. And as I said before, this is not a fishing expedition. We know that the Biden administration covertly, but actively harassed and intimidated and strategized with enemies of the Catholic Church in order to bring down the American Catholic Church. And they were nearly successful. We recognize that Francis and Supich and Pritzker all shut down all the Catholic churches in America during COVID. They all mandated the COVID vaccine. They were all in lockstep. The Catholic Church was in lockstep with the globalists during the pandemic. And so this is not only urgency for the salvation of the church, but also for humanity. Because if we are going to continue to allow this radical globalist agenda push forward, take away our rights, enslave mankind, then without even bothering to look for the documents that prove that machinations were underway, that this whole scene was concocted, I don't know how much more I can do than to plead with the Trump administration to abide by the law, look for these documents, and bring some sanity and restore some civility and faith to the Catholic Church and some understanding about what happened not only during the really tumultuous years of the Benedict papacy, where he was just harassed and terrorized and frustrated in all of his efforts to restore the church, but also the pressure he was put under to resign. And so what's so interesting, John Henry, is we saw this week what happened. Why did Pope Leo meet with David Axelrod, the foremost political operative in America, Obama's campaign architect, who has pushed the political narratives of the American Democratic left? Axelrod, on April 9th, he met with him. He hasn't met with the President of the United States. And as Frank Walker of Canon 212 said, Leo went and hired a consulting firm to promote his politics. And why did Leo spend a 40-minute meeting with with the purported 2028 Democratic candidate for president, J.B. Pritzker, but not the President of the United States? And then by pure coincidence, the Pope starts attacking the Trump administration, and the three most prominent cardinals, liberal cardinals, come out on 60 Minutes to start trashing the policies of this administration. This feels like a political operation in motion. And, now we have the Pope in Algeria. He has gone to a mosque, and he is calling for communion between Christians and Muslims under the patronage, God help us, of the Blessed Mother, calling a mosque a place that represents the space proper to God. But he has been silent on the Islamic terrorism and persecution in Algeria, in the Middle East, all over Africa. So these are huge stakes at the forefront of our globe, and we need to be aggressive as the left has been. We have the truth. We have the beauty of the faith. Look, I wasn't born yesterday. I was raised and weaned in the Chicago democratic political machine. This smacks of a political, as Chris Jackson would say, midterm psyop in a cassock. But in Chicago politics, we call this clout to take down an opponent. And Leo's and his three leftist cardinals want to play hardball politics with Donald Trump. And he better ready to take this incoming, but he has the tools to fight back. Not just his tweets, but the information the Trump administration is sitting on.
To be honest, there's no better motivation, I think, than Trump has ever had in seeing that now the Democratic Church is trying to clobber him and the Republicans out of the midterms. Liz Yore, thank you so much for joining us. God bless you.
Thank you, John Henry. Thank you.
And God bless all of you. And we'll see you next time.